Power Talks, empowering you through the voice of truth with your host, Dr. Joel Hunter.
Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Joel Hunter, host of Power Talks, empowering you through the voice of truth. On today's program, Jim Coffin, the Executive Director of the Interfaith Council of Central Florida, Tim Johnson, pastor of Orlando World Outreach Center, and Roderick Zach, the pastor of Rejoice in the Lord Ministries, are here to help us understand what racial and religious division and reconciliation really are and how we can work together to make things better. So I was telling them beforehand, it's such a pleasure because all these guys are close friends of mine. We have a long history. First of all, I just want to start off with this. There is an event coming up in April. We very few times use this program to talk about an event, but this is a pretty important one for our community. On April 16th at St. Mark's AME Church, starting at 6 o'clock, we're going to have an event that is sponsored by the Urban League, but it is co-sponsored by your two organizations. And it's going to be talking about both racial and religious prejudice. Can you say something about that, Reverend Zach?
Well, with the recent, unfortunately, hate crimes that are occurring, so that was included as a part of the agenda. Race is still an important issue to be addressed as far as how we can do this better and how the Christian community can contribute to reconciliation. Those are the two areas. Unfortunately, white nationalists, violent extremists are out there, and so that's what's being responded to. How can we address that? How can we overcome that kind of bias? And it's and then in some instances they claim to be Christian, and we know that's antithetical to what being a Christian, a person of peace, or religious. Period. That claim can't be made. So how can we take back that territory and make sure that the faith is represented properly?
Good. Jim, let me come to you. You're the head of the Interreligious Council, Interfaith Council of Central Florida. You deal with a lot of leaders of a lot of different religions, but also from a lot of racial backgrounds. What is the secret to a pluralistic effort? That is, each one of them is valuable for their particular perspective, without giving up your own or watering down your own faith tradition.
Christianity obviously introduced a number of radical things. And one of those radical things is that certain social barriers that had existed before, status and so on, disappeared. So the Apostle Paul said there's neither Jew nor Greek, there's neither male nor female, there's neither bond nor free, because really there's an equality there that comes not only from creation, but comes from redemption as well. And so to treat everyone with dignity and respect in no way is antithetical to any of my beliefs. In other words, that's the essence of the belief. That's the belief on steroids, is to do that. And so every person I look at is God's creation. It's a brother and sister. We may have different skin color, we may have different culture, we may have different religion or no religion. Okay, but we're all one as humanity.
Pastor Tim, you had a previous life, previous to the pastorate, and you were a pro football player, played for the Steelers, for the Redskins, and then for the Broncos. Bengals. Sorry, Bengals. Important distinction for us football fans, especially for a guy from Ohio. Very, very important distinction. But and even have a Super Bowl ring. I can't believe I'm sitting with somebody with a Super Bowl ring. I want to ask this question. All of us as faith leaders recognize the prejudice and the racism that exists generally in society, but we have in our mind, well, there got to be a few fields where racism really isn't quite as apparent. Is that true in sports, or is it very apparent in sports as well?
I think you find in sports a common ground for everybody to share their humanity on first, and that is when you suit up, you want to win. If you're not interested in winning, the coach really doesn't care what ethnicity you are. You won't be moving past that moment. So for us, the common ground was we all had an ambition to exercise our gifts, talents, and skills to do something bigger as a team than we could individually. And so we had a common ground. But you do see it played out, the whole idea of racism, which you know what I think about that word in of itself is racist, because I think there's only one human race, and we've distinguished the human race into the value of our color being greater than our common dignity as human beings created in the image of God. And so if I can label something and value it based on what I see, not on what's true in fact, our DNA shows that we are more alike than unalike. And so the thinness of our skin is so small compared to the substance of who we really are together as human beings. And so I think if we can relabel this into ethnicities rather than races, then we find ourselves saying, you're a human being, I'm a human being. But if we're racist, then I can actually categorically make you more of an animal. I can actually make you lesser than if I just talk about a race that it has greater regard than another race versus you're a human being, I'm a human being. We happen to have different ethnicities and cultures. So in football, there was a common ground.
That's good.
But there's still ethnic division in some respects. It's not as glaring and it's very subtle because the common ground is greater.
Yeah, I love that. Well, we're on mission together here, and I do think that's a really great, even as spiritual leaders. You know, if you have a mission in common, then your differences are going to be more complementary than competitive, or even noticeable. Reverend Zach, we go back a long way, and you've just been one of the wonderful leaders in our community, gentle spirit, but very keen insights. And you're the new leader of the African American Council of Christian Clergy in Central Florida. Tell us about that group that is formed around ethnicity, but yet and has a common mission. Tell us about how you see the group adding to the community as a whole, rather than just advocating for on some sort of racial basis or something like that.
Well, you know, the faith, again, getting back to this common strand of that unifies us, the faith is first, the gospel, and the Bible, the Word of God. So we're part of an overall fabric of the Christian faith that espouses the importance of Jesus Christ and His teachings, that ethical, moral imperative. But we also organize ourselves ethnically, really to point up the importance of the last, the least, the lost. You know, unfortunately, you know, the disparity still exists, and there's still some separation, which is part of what we're talking about today. How we can get to more integrated kind of understanding of who we are racially, and not be as divided ethnically. And so one of our goals is to advance that, is to advance this connection, to advocate for us being stronger together, better together, and that we can do more together than we can apart. So a primary interest of ours is to basically reach across the aisle, per se, religiously, racially, culturally, economically, you know, so that there'll be a better quality of life for all of God's children. You know.
Let me follow that up, because I know you have a program. Part of the consequences of the racial disparity and inequality is that some segments of our population have gotten left behind. Right. And you have a great program, I just learned about this the other day, called Need to Read. Right. And it's for kids that have come from a background that maybe has not had as much access to that early education. Could you tell us about that?
Well, Need to Read is a program to help combat low literacy. So unlike other educational programs, it starts from 0, you know, 1 day old to 4 or 5 years old. So the focus is to put books in the hands of parents who primarily can't afford it, and to also give some best practices to parents about how you nurture children so that children don't arrive, if they're from a poorer household, 13, 14 months behind developmentally in pre-K, you know, but you know, kindergarten, I'm arriving behind because I've had exposure to less words. Some studies have been done where a child from an affluent home has been exposed to 30 million more words than a child from a poorer home. And you can imagine, if I'm making a decision to buy books or buy food, I'm gonna buy food, you know? And, or if I haven't had the background of being read to, the importance of exposure to words, then I'm not gonna give that back to my child. So we're trying to do some preventive programs to make sure that young families knows best practices as to how to best nurture their children to get them ready for school. And so, you know, we have a website, feedtheneedtoread.com. We're trying to marshal donations to give away books. This past summer, we gave 5,000 books away.
That's fantastic.
To young families who are in need.
Fantastic. That'll be up on your screen. So just if you want to help.
Right. Thank you.
Jim, let me go to the other end of the spectrum age-wise. And you know, a lot of the people that we deal with in the Interfaith Council are older. I often tell people, the older you get, the more you have hardening of the categories. You know, it's where you just you think in terms of categories, and this is my distinct identity, and it's a little bit tougher to think there's anything that we could learn from each other. You have been one of those leaders that I've just really admired for not just getting people to cooperate, but really learn from each other. What do you think is the advantage? Let's go to the positive. Instead of just talking about racial or religious prejudice, let's talk about what are the opportunities we have if we really get to know someone who's different than we are. Tell us about how you've seen people learn from each other.
You've heard me say this before, but my father used to say to me when I was growing up, every person you meet is your superior in some way, and in that way you can learn from them. And I think that's true people groups. You know, every people group is a superior group in some way, and so we can learn from them. So we should always go with the sense of I'm a learner all my life and I'm a teacher all my life, because we have this exchange of, you know. And so, you know, as I interact with other faith traditions, inevitably there are things that I see, emphases that they have, practices that they have that I look at and I'm envious of it. And
let me stop, because people who are listening go, I wonder who he's talking about here. Could you give us a couple of examples?
Well, okay, with Jews. The Jews, the rabbis, you know, particularly, they disagree a lot. and yet they can work together, and they can live with ambiguity. And I come from a background where it's either this way or it's that way, you know, and then I'd even be willing to fight about that. Okay, the Jews might be willing to argue strongly about it, but they could say, well, okay, we can live with the idea, you know, that there might be more. You know, with the Muslims, you know, the fact that they commit themselves to such a regimen, it's, you know, it's not necessarily the way I do my spiritual life, but I admire the fact that they, you know, they are committed to that, and they don't bend from that very much, you know, the committed. And, you know, I read the Sikh, Guru Granth Sahib, the Sikh scriptures. They actually have people from different faith traditions. They have Hindu writers and Sikh writers and Muslim writers who wrote in their scriptures.
Wow.
And so they're already kind of this reaching out to the wisdom as they can find it wherever it is. And that doesn't mean that we have to jettison anything that we have. It's, we can say, you know, I like that practice. That would actually enhance my Christianity if I bring that kind of thing into it. And if not literal in every respect, at least in principle. You know, in principle, bringing that into my life. So I just try to go to my interaction with all the different faith traditions and with atheists as well, and say, what can they teach me? And the atheists, what they do for me is that they pin me to the wall. You know, and I better come up with better answers. Okay, because the ones I've given aren't good enough.
Okay, that's really good. That's good. Pastor Tim, I want to ask you about practical relationships. You're one of the best relational guys I know. I mean, there's nobody that doesn't like you. I mean, everybody loves Pastor Tim.
All two people you just met.
And part of it is your humor. I just love that. But when we talk about, you know, reconciliation is just almost a depressing word. You know, it just starts off at a very negative, okay, we got to work through this, we got to negotiate, I guess I got to tolerate you and all that kind of stuff. But that's not what any of us want. All of us want to just enjoy one another and learn from one another and get rid of our blind spots. You know, I was with my friend T.D. Jakes last week, and he gave this talk about blind spots, you know, and so I guess I want to learn from you. What's your background that you didn't come out, you're more recently in the pastorate, you were active in the church, you've been active in the church for a long time, all the way from ushering to elder and everywhere in between. But you lived your life as a follower of Jesus, but always saw people as people. And not as religious objects, whether they were right and wrong, you know, didn't care. So what would you teach us all about being friends outside the categories? You know, just being friends and getting along with people. Because that's a much more positive vision than it is trying to overcome differences.
Yeah. I think we live in a culture that's very, very bent on molding all of us into its mold of what it expects of us. The Apostle Paul said, if I seek to be a servant, if I seek to please man, I cease to be a servant of God. And I think there's a part of us that wants to please everyone, but we find ourselves so incomplete and wanting to just please everyone, and then you find yourself losing yourself in the company of different people depending on who you're with. And I think coming from where I've come from, all the experiences I've had, I have a lot of reasons to maybe be angry at certain kinds of people or be indifferent toward others. But I say the secret for me is that I'm healed. That Jesus healed my heart. that all that I've been through and all that I've done, most people see themselves as a victim, not someone who's victimized others. So I've been a victim of circumstances of sin in my life, but I've also victimized, I've also been that person, that perpetrator that has committed a lot of sins before I came to the cross. And when I came to Jesus in college at Penn State, I had no idea this gospel was real, didn't grow up in church, was not religious, didn't know all the lingo, the language, the jargon. I just knew I was a lonely, broken soul that was angry about some things and who couldn't overcome my sin. And when I came to the cross and Jesus actually healed my heart, I didn't know that was real. I didn't know you could actually, because the few little Christians that I saw were sort of hypocritical, and I judged them because I thought if I knew God, I don't think it would look like that. And God doesn't seem to be well represented. So I was always able to push off the idea of faith on what's not being done by everyone else. So that everybody else was my excuse to not really know who Jesus is. But when the gospel came to me and I had to make a choice, it made me afraid because I always thought I had to do something. I always felt like I had to perform at a certain level, get myself together, until I recognized it wasn't what I can do, it's what he did. Look at what he did. Look at the wrath of God. Look at the punishment. Look at the stripping of the dignity of his humanity so I can be restored. And the power through the resurrection that he offered gave me a chance to say, you know what? I'm going to just see if this is real. When I got healed in my heart, it allowed me to know what love was, first of all. Real love. I always thought love was what I could get from people. Then I realized through the love of Jesus, it's what I can give to people, not what I could get. And so I always feel like God did something so unique in my heart that I want to give away whatever I got to people wherever they are. And so to be able to make myself a safe place for people, regardless of who you are, where you're from, is what Jesus did for me, and that's what I offer to people.
That's rich. Pastor Zach, we got a few minutes left here, but I want to come up with a sticky question here.
Okay.
I know you operate just like I do with our wives are our very best friends and our partners and so on and so forth. And it reminds me that all of us don't just operate on our own. We operate with very close relationships. And so when we want to be brave and cross boundaries and so on and so forth, we also have people in our inner circle that aren't quite that adventurous.
That's true.
How do you negotiate? Let's take a chance and be with people who are different than us. When you have people in your life that say, "No, let's be safe. Let's take care of what we got here." How do we do that?
Wow, it's just for myself, and I've had to do that. And ironically, I've had to face those kind of challenges because in different roles that I've had to represent interests that could cause the family or my wife, in some instances, to be a little bit hesitant. But I just stepped out on faith and tried to be the leader. And then, the good news was the environment was something that they embraced once they got in it. And I would encourage, one of the things that's needed for reconciliation is exposure. One of the things I admire about you is that you took a walk across the room, in essence, to consider being around some folk that were different ethnically, racially, and so forth, and have a conversation, have a lunch, bring people in, and I think more pastors, we need to lead the way in trying to develop that and model that for our congregations. I think we're not taking the onus that we need to help us mend here. And I think we have a responsibility just first to develop a few relationships. Like you were talking about our connectivity, how we go back 30 years. And that was, and it may be more organic for some in terms of real natural, but it's almost like when you become a pastor, you got to speak to everybody.
Yeah. That's right.
You know, just speak to more people,
Yeah.
you know,
That's part
connect
of
with more people. That's part of what we got to do. And if we could expand our horizons to Jerusalem, Judea, Jerusalem as home, Judea as people of like nationality, Samaria, when are we going to get there?
Yeah.
People of different ethnic backgrounds.
Yeah.
And we have that in our mandate.
Yeah.
So,
right.
so I think all of us need to do that.
Yeah.
And I think that would move the arrow, the needle more toward us accomplishing this, first for our people, for our congregations, and then we'll see, hopefully we can trickle down into society more if they see it modeled in us.
Yes.
If I could just jump in here, there's a quote from Alexander Pope, the old philosopher poet of a few hundred years ago, and he said, "Men must be taught as if we taught them not, and things proposed as things forgot." And I think as leaders, where we're trying to move people, you know, from where they are to where we'd like them to be, we kind of have to be a little bit subtle about it. And one of the ways we can be subtle is simply to tell our own story, because 9 chances out of 10, we were at one time where they are.
That's exactly right.
Okay, so it's not like it's foreign territory. And if we simply tell the story, you know, I used to be bigoted in this way, you know, and I had this experience, you know, that opened my eyes. And then you don't really have to go into great detail about it. You just tell the story.
I love it.
This is how I moved.
Yeah, I love it. Using our own struggles as a starting point. That's really good. We're out of time. I can't believe we're out of time.
Wow.
But I want to thank our panelists, Reverend Roderick Zach, Reverend Jim Coffin, and Reverend Tim Johnson, true leaders in this community and good friends of mine. And so thank you guys for being here.
Thank you.
Remember, these discussions are just that. They're discussions among us. We'd love to see you continue the discussions at home, though, and go one step farther. Get involved, because when power talks, you're empowered through the voice of truth. See you next time.
You just watched Power Talks, a Good Life 45 original production that makes you part of our Hope Team here on Good Life 45, where hope happens.